Chapter 17, Parts 1 and 2. Chapter 17, Kronus. Endgame. Part 1, Blighted Mansion of Misery and Mirth. Nurgle Domain, the Warp. In the heart of his domain stood the Plague Lord's humble home. The twisted light of the warp itself crept through the jagged edges of cracked and jagged windows, broken and splattered with filth. Half-rotted through shutters sang dirges of joy, while toxic winds hammered them in maggot-infested walls. Shattered drains burst open, releasing their rotten contents, maggots and flies inside, staining carpets and turning wood into little more than twisted offal. Mold crept up the walls, blistering the paint, which eternally flaked away, yet kept its poisonous glow. Crooked chimneys merrily billowed poison and pestilence, while demonic birds sang dirges to their father and his beloved. Bone trees ripened with decaying fruit, which rotted on their branches, while flies buzzed around, gorging themselves on the rich offerings. Deep inside the mason, Grandfather Nurgle's great bulk towered over a bubbling cauldron. He stirred it carefully, adding spices as appropriate. His beloved deserved only the best. The Plague Lord kept glancing at Aisha, while she glared at the cauldron. She had a point. The last few brews didn't turn well. He was going to outdo himself this time. Wait and see. Besides, it wasn't his fault. Khorne's temper tantrum ruined a delicious blood fever that would slowly boil you from inside so you could properly appreciate the gift. It was that feathered and beaked freak's fault that a new take on the classic plague fizzled out. It has been screaming about everything going to plan, you see, for days now. As if anyone would buy that now. Nurgle bobbed his horned head and let some snot and hissing sweat fall into the cauldron before waiting for 3 heartbeats and stirring counterclockwise. His work was as much an art as a science. It was almost time. The brew needed a few more minutes by his reckoning and just a couple more ingredients. He was sure it would be ready in time too. The Father of Plagues raised his massive head and looked in the distance. The odds were even, and the coin fell tails. His imprisoned child stirred, irritated by all those cleansing oils and stung by the anathema's light. It might be for the best this way. While otherwise he could have extracted the unclean one and retained it for later use, now he had an opportunity to salvage something from Khorne's great failure. It was either that, or lose it in a way that benefited the other side. Damn Khorne, because really, was it so hard to show some patience and temperance? 10,000 years ago, the 4 of them made sure the war was theirs to win and the anathemas to lose. Ever since then, the Imperium and humanity had been slowly, painfully, and so deliciously decaying and rotting from the inside. It had been only a matter of time before they collapsed. Every victory was a mere holding action, prolonging the time they had to enjoy Nurgle's gift. So he naturally approved. Every setback brought them to the inevitable end and rebirth. That was all right too. Until now, when Khorne's foolish impatience offered the anathema a chance for a real victory. Nurgle grimaced, bile rising in his gorge at the thought of a galaxy covered by despicable Necron machines, denying his blessed gifts. The god of decay paused his stirring to pick up a glowing jar. He removed a pair of writhing parasites. The little deers nipped happily at his fingers, and he scratched them before letting them fall into the brew. It hissed merrily and turned blood red. Nurgle closed the jar before the other deers could escape and put it back on the top shelf while humming to himself. Nurgle had a decision to make. His first option was to do nothing. He was the most patient being in the warp. He could wait. Sooner or later, entropy would have its due. Everything will decay. That much was inevitable. He was inevitable. Even the Necron and their technology couldn't resist the ravages of time indefinitely. How could they, when it was the Necron-tier tumors, ravaged bodies, and fear of death that gave birth to his essence? Well, to a part of it, but that didn't matter. Nurgle loved everything that made him up, and he represented those essences equally. He was a generous and loving grandfather like that, not like his counterparts. Those were either insane, outright barbaric, or simply sick and depraved in a way he would never tolerate in his domain. Why, he shuddered at the thought of what that pervert might have done to his sweet, innocent Isha. 3 more stirs, and now all he had to do was lead the brew bubble for a bit and make a choice. Nurgle's second option was a direct intervention. His little unclean one was tired and weak after so long without proper food and care. Left to its own devices, it would lose, and that loss would strengthen the anathema's hand. However, if Nurgle intervened, if he fought and empowered his unclean one, then he might just resolve the problem once and for all. An outright victory would do, either that or deceiving the humans that they had to purge Kronus because of his blessing. That despicable alliance would die on that cursed planet, and he would hold his success over the fools' heads. There was only one problem with that plan. The anathema's light still illuminated Kronus, cleansing it. It was so clean and bright. That was utterly and contemptuously terrible. In the end, Nurgle decided to act. It was the best option he had, all thanks to his duplicitous colleagues. If this went wrong, he would know who he would have to blame. Grandfather Nurgle focused his immense power, his whole domain stirred sensing his intent, and for a single moment stood still. A tremendous beam of energy shot into the warp, covering the distance between Nurgle's domain and Kronus in an instant. It slammed into the anathema's light and punched through, lancing into the heart of Victory Bay and slamming into the Hellstorm cannon. The anathema reacted as soon as the attack began, and for a brief moment, the rage that met him made Nurgle stagger back. His bulk shook, and he spilled his cauldron. The bubbling contents went everywhere, dousing him, splashing over Aisha, who squealed in delight, and finally falling into the drains to find their way to a planet to bless. This wasn't a defensive action like the one Anathema fought for 10,000 years to keep his throne room secure. It wasn't a sucker punch against an arrogant ass like Khorne. Grandfather Nurgle was ready for such tricks, the Anathema making a stand and spending the necessary energy to fight him here and now that the Plague Father didn't quite see. Such a conflict was dangerous. It could weaken him too much if he persisted, giving an opening to the other three. However, at the same time, the sheer strain would reduce the time Anathema had. The Golden Throne was fraying, falling apart, and decaying. It was never to survive the energies now writhing within the Anathema. Two titans clashed above Kronus. All the while, their champions waged war on the surface. The Golden Throne, Imperial Palace, Holy Terror. The fragment of the Emperor bound to the Golden Throne writhed in agony. The combined energy fed to him by humanity as a whole was both rapture and the greatest possible torture. His wounded body and ravaged couldn't properly contain that much power without ascending and dooming his people. The soul shattered into 1,000 fragments, many of them scattered across the galaxy, and some of them even did some good over the ages. The body turned into little more than a tortured husk, barely maintained by dying machinery and countless sacrifices. For 10,000 years, the Emperor maintained his vigil. For 10,000 years, he suffered for humanity. He didn't stop even as his people turned away from the imperial truth, from the light of science and understanding. He kept fighting for the Imperium, even as it became a corrupted and bloated monster. Even as the Imperium's current existence mocked his efforts and the sacrifices of all those who fought to bring forth a golden age, the Emperor kept protecting it. For 10,000 years, he watched humanity slowly die, while struggling to find a solution that might make it all worth it in the end. Countless contingencies and desperate gambits carried over the gulf of time did little more than keep the Imperium from collapse. In the end, the truth was painful and obvious. The Imperium as it was its own greatest enemy. It was less than an empire than a loose collection of 1,001 petty kingdoms vying for power and influence, while humanity died around them. It didn't matter. The Emperor kept suffering, kept sacrificing all he had to in order to give his people more time, to find a way to bring forth a miracle, because nothing less could offer salvation in this dark age. Now, finally, when everything raced towards the end, he could see clearly. Chaos had played him. For 10,000 years, he had been losing the war that mattered. His contingencies weren't enough. His desperate measures would at best prolong humanity's final death throes. Cadia would fall, chaos would rend the galaxy asunder, while countless enemies picked up humanity's decaying carcass, while the tyrannid swarms came to devour them all. They had 40, perhaps 60 years before Chaos would be able to launch their final crusade. It wasn't enough time to prepare. There were too many other threats to deal with, both internal and external. Despite that, the Emperor was going to fight, and when the time came, he would give humanity an end, one at their own terms. At his terms. The time for desperate measures and contingencies was over. They weren't going to be enough. They weren't the last time. At that point, Chaos made a mistake. It happened a time when the Emperor had little left to lose. It no longer mattered if the Astronomicon could last for much longer. Khorne misstepped, and the Emperor struck. Fate shifted. A herald of Khorne died on Kronus, struck down by an unlikely alliance between humans and aliens. One of the Emperor's shards was there, observing his handiwork. It wasn't much, yet there was a small and vulnerable hope blossoming on that distant world. By itself, those events wouldn't be enough to avert humanity's fall. However, they might buy precious time, might raise the price for victory just enough, that in the end, Chaos would lose as well. Perhaps that would be the best the man once known as Revelation could hope for now. The essence of that person suffered on the Golden Throne for eternity, keeping his broken mind and soul aimed at the same general direction even when he was beyond hope. What the Emperor didn't expect was to see the enemies of humanity make yet another mistake on Kronus. First, the young Eldar Taldir, then Khorne himself, and now Nurgle. Revelation could see what that pestilent abomination intended. It might very well work, erasing the faint hope blossoming on Kronus. Mere months ago, the Emperor would have contested such a blow, of course. However, he couldn't have gone all out. The price to pay, in both power and time burned out of the Astronomicon, would have been too high. However, here and now, the Golden Throne would last a century or two, even if the price would be an immediate and sudden failure afterward. In that time, humanity and the Imperium would either find salvation, or it would be time to go out into the night, taking out as many of their enemies down as they could. Months ago, even weeks ago, the best he could have hoped for would be yet another expensive stalemate. Revelation let go of all the restraints binding his power. The Golden Throne blazed with energy, and the mere backslash filled the great chamber it laid within with blinding light. His companions fell to their knees and averted their eyes, which burned even behind the protection of their helmets. The Emperor focused on the crystallized belief of all humanity, their faith, hopes, pain, and suffering, everything they were or would be. Humanity's faith was his armor, their belief, his shield, and their hope turned into a flaming sword burning its way through the warp. His will made manifest above Kronus. The immaterium around that distant world ignited. Rot and decay met cleansing fire, shaking the heavens themselves asunder. Victory Bay Kronus. All pieces were finally in place, and it was beautiful. The living saint, his crown piece, acted first. Golden radiance enveloped him like a glove, and he charged ahead on fiery wings. It was just in time, too. Their protection exploded outwards, covering the crowds with a comforting blanket made of their power. A wave of decay slammed into the radiance, threatening to overwhelm them when Revelation acted as he knew the poor bastard would. Gods clashed above them, giving the mortals below a fighting chance. Dozens of Mechanicus adepts died screaming. Their flesh decayed into soup, while the mechanical parts rusted and rotted away into sludge. Pestilent winds blew away, carrying deadly plagues upon the citizens of Victory Bay. "Fight for your lives," the saint bellowed even as he struggled to keep the tide of entropy at bay. The Imperial Guard stirred. Infantry turned around and opened fire at the boiling mass of rotting flesh, engulfing the Hellstorm cannon. Vehicle crews got out of their days and hurried to button up their machines. The vehicles themselves glowed brightly, while their purity seals burned with the strain to keep the power of Nurgle himself away. All over the city, people fell to their knees, racked by pain. Their blood turned dark, and black veins bulged all over their bodies. Dark red blood flowed freely from their mouths and noses while they shed red tears. Yet instead of collapsing in despair or surrendering to the enticing whispers of Nurgle, the citizens of Victory Bay prayed for salvation. They had a living saint among them, the Emperor's own chosen symbol, made manifest to offer salvation. Those close enough to the Titan cannon could see the saint standing tall and proud, fighting to protect them. They didn't run. Despair could find no purchase in their hearts. Their faith burned strong. They cried to the Emperor for salvation. They prayed for aid and for their saint to emerge victorious. Revelation answered, matching his might against Nurgle's. Burning embers fell all over the realm of rot and decay when the Emperor struck. For one brief moment, an Eldar goddess could see a glimpse of the real world after eons of captivity. She could see her captor pushed back, see and hear Nurgle's cries of pain and anger. And it was glorious. At the same time, a handful of Eldar could perceive Isha's bound and caged form. The moment passed. Thunderclaps shook Victory Bay when the Necrons entered the fray. Say what you will about the murderous machines, they were no cowards. 2 Necron lords and their cryptex marched upon the manifesting greater demon of Nurgle. Lychguard phased into existence and went into the fray. And 4 pylons arrived through an emergency deployment that fried dozens of unlucky people. They activated, reinforcing reality and sending back the Eldar in the dubious safety of their minds. And so it begins. The Emperor's shard rippled with satisfaction and shot into the heavens. It was eager to rejoin Revelation and become a part of the battle waged above Kronus. Part 2. Victory Bay, Kronus. Rohan fell to his knees, gasping for breath. His brain did its best to leak out of his ears, and all he could hear was the screams of the damned. The Ranger did his best to keep his being separated from the Sea of Souls, and knew for a fact that he was still alive only thanks to the Necrons. Their pylons forcefully strengthened reality and pushed his mind back within his head. Yet the terrible vision wouldn't go away. Rohan beheld Isha, lost goddess of fertility and rejuvenation, imprisoned by Nurgle. He got a glimpse of the Chaos God himself, cloaked by the very essence of rot and decay, clashing with the human Emperor. He saw gods reenact the war in heaven, or perhaps the fall. Rohan saw the rotting corpse worshipped by the humans stand against one of the Chaos Gods and push the abomination back, a feat not even Cain could boast of during the fall. Whatever else the human Emperor might be in the material world, in the warp, he was a monster like few others. Even now, under the dubious protection of the Necron pylons, Rohan could sense the clash burning through the Sea of Souls. The mere echoes he experienced shook his very soul. The warlock wrenched off his helmet, revealing a pale, ancient face. The experienced warrior threw up his breakfast and convulsed. Rohan could see blood leaking from the corner of his eyes, nose and ears. Despite that, the warlock was the first Eldari to stagger to his feet. Warp fire surrounded his form. He threw himself at the greater demon, manifesting nearby, with a scream of pure rage and despair. The tank crew get up next and looked wildly around, searching for weapons that were in their vehicle parked a few kilometers away. Rohan also saw human soldiers fall prey to Nurgle's gifts. "There, take up their weapons," the Ranger shouted and stumbled to his feet. The crude laser weaponry so loved by the humans would have to do. He couldn't run now, not now, when all his soul cried with burning rage. Rohan picked up the laser weapon of a woman too busy choking on her own blood and opened fire. There was little point in aiming at the growing pile of offal beginning to take shape. It wasn't like he could miss. The tank crew followed suit, and soon a handful of Eldar stood on the edge of the podium shoulder to shoulder with bleeding humans and Astartes pouring all the firepower they could into the Neverborn. Jordan's whole form cracked with eldritch power. The Psyker pointed his power weapon at the demon and unleashed a powerful arcane bolt before falling to his knees and panting in exhaustion. "General, we need to go. You need to take charge of this Emperor-damned disaster." Commissar Norman shook Lucas. Alexander looked at his long-time acquaintance through bloodshot eyes. He tried to say something, but all that came out of his throat was wet viscera, and he choked, struggling to breathe. "Amundsen," the general whispered tiredly. "He's in charge." He shook Norman with all the little strength he had. The artillery commander was back at the HQ, overseeing today's events from its safety. A wave of warmth washed over them, while Alexander wetly gasped for breath. He was barely aware of Norman's grim nod. Then the commissar was gone. Good man, that one. For a commissar. Lucas blinked off blood tears and found a new source of strength burning within his chest. He could hear countless choked prayers, almost drowning the cacophony of combat. All he had left was praying and the hope that it would be enough. They should have brought heavier weapons, Antaeus concluded. The librarian had a power sword, bolter, and knife. His psyker power as well, however, using those now was a highly dubious proposition. The arrival of the Necron pylons offered precious respite because, as awe-inspiring as the events in the Immaterium were, there was nothing the librarian could do about them. Above and beyond them, the Emperor himself fought Nurgle and slowly but surely prevailed. It was awe-inspiring, and if before Antaeus hadn't believed the leader of mankind was a god, today left no such illusions. The Emperor fought beside them today in all his divine glory. "Have faith, brothers, the Emperor is with us." Antaeus roared and shot off a psychic blast at the demon threatening them. The librarian knew his words were true in more than one way. Below the stands, the Inquisitor stood tall, protecting a small group of tech priests and a cluster of regular soldiers with his light. The chosen of the Emperor was on one knee, as if praying before the battle. Cleansing energy emanated from Vale, keeping the rot and decay at bay. Moths of golden light flew through the air, burning bright and searing away corruption. "Captain Ignatius, we've got a demonic incursion in progress. My position." Captain Thul's voice cracked over the battle net. "Deploy all reserve forces as soon as you have them properly outfitted. We need immediate resupply. Heavy weapons, blessed munitions, and sacred war gear. If we reach the case Omega Green 1, you're authorized to fire on our position at your judgment. Authorization code, Raziel 19 Malcador." An inhuman screech shook the whole area. Its disturbing, piercing notes scratched over the armor that was Antaeus's faith. Small forms rose from the bubbling filth covering the cursed cannon, and deformed tiny demons staggered out before running to tear apart anyone they could see. "Hold firm, they shall not pass." The Inquisitor thundered in voice, not his own. Antaeus spared a glance that way while reloading. Vale was on his feet, holding high a burning sword. It was hard to focus on the Inquisitor due to the divine light dancing around him like a halo. The guard answered with lasfire, and then the vehicles let it rip with everything at their disposal. Multi-lasers scythed down waves of Nurglings. Flamers created a burning wall between the infantry and the demons, while heavy bolters blew them apart. The Baneblade was on fire, its purity seals turning it into a flaming island. It opened up with all the secondaries it had, reserving the battle cannon until there was no other choice. If it used it here and now, it would mess up the nearby unprotected infantry, including the Saint anchoring their formation. The only saving grace of the disaster was that wiser heads had the field hospital removed from the park in anticipation of the parade. Otherwise, Antaeus didn't want to think about what would have happened. "Resupply is en route. ETA 2 mics, the captain announced. "Reinforcements are en route. ETA 4 minutes. It would take at least that long to swap the anti-armor war gear meant for use against the Necrons, if they turned hostile, to something more useful in the current situation. Fortunately, it was much faster to send down a standard resupply pod. This was irritating, Amarkan thought. No, irritation didn't do his current mental state justice. The Necron Lord knew that in theory the so-called Chaos Gods existed, that they were powerful warp abominations. The echoes that his ships in orbit could detect, and the barely coherent mumbling of human and Eldari psykers filtered through the Necron network, told a different story. They were at the epicenter of a clash that wouldn't be amiss during the worst days of the war in heaven. And they were ill-equipped to face a foe of that magnitude. It was both a piece of good news and a sobering revelation that the human emperor chose to personally intervene. If the humans could be believed anyway. That by itself was cause to revisit both the use humanity could be as allies and the potential threat they represented. That was for later, if there would be later. Amarkan issued contingency orders and kept firing all his weapons at the abomination taking form. One of his ships already raced out of the system. Constant combat data flowed towards his tomb world, ensuring that if the worst happened, his dynasty would be warned. The part of his mind monitoring the reconnaissance efforts over the rest of the settlement showed hundreds of thousands of humans falling, struck down by impossibly fast-acting diseases. More warp influence there. Deploy additional pylons, Amarkan advised. Deimos containment zone is currently irrelevant. They could always secure it again or purge it from orbit if it came to that. I'm already doing so. Orbital support might be needed. Herald of Victory countered. Amarkan could see that. Despite several pylons already in place and active, the abomination they faced almost got recognizable if twisted shape. Inquisitor Vale could draw on warp power, perhaps his emperors, just like the local abomination, fed from the dregs of a greater one. The battle in the warp simply overpowered the available pylons. He ran a quick calculation. It claimed that without the pylons already on site, they might have to execute a tactical retreat or risk being overwhelmed if they attempted to hold this position. That would be a less than ideal outcome. There were hundreds of thousands of allied civilians behind them who would die or worse if they fell back. While Amarkun shouldn't have cared, he could remember their people dying helplessly while their leaders were unable to protect them. His people. Avoiding the repeat of that fate was one of the reasons why so many gleefully accepted biotransference. Those weren't his people. Amarkan couldn't say he cared about them, because he didn't. However, merely being placed in such a situation again was infuriating. Then there was honor. Necron's honor on this world suffered more than enough already. It wouldn't suffer again if Amarkan had anything to say about it. Besides, he had fought in the War of Heaven from its beginning to the end. He had faced worse, even if then he had been much better prepared and had a proper army under his command. Deploy the reserves. This abomination dies today, Amarkan declared. Transporters came to life on board his ships, and mass deployment began. Herald of Victory had the same idea, and he called everyone. Lighting strikes lit up Victory Bay, leaving behind after-images, ionized air, and squads of Necron warriors. Gauss weaponry struck the abomination again and again, hiding it from sight. Sensors revealed they could destroy its mass almost as fast as it grew. That wasn't nearly good enough. However, more pylons might be the cure for that particular problem. The sky cracked open and transport barges phased in, carrying a mobile pylon each. They came online as one and ensured an uneasy stalemate. If nothing else, that deployment brought a brief respite to their mortal allies. Chapter 17, Parts 3 and 4. Chapter 17, Kronus, Endgame. Part 3, Victory Bay, Kronus. Today Charles had one simple job entrusted to him by the Lord Inquisitor, living saint and friend, Delcatar Vale. After the near failure last time, the Commissar took no chances. Their small corner of the stand was as close to a bunker as the Mechanicus cyborgs could make it in a hurry. No one wanted to be near them, which simplified the security situation. Well, almost no one. Lieutenant Regina was back, with a wide smile on her face and what looked like all the camera crews the propaganda department could find, buy, or steal. All those cameras gave Charles a flashback, and he grabbed his weapons, while his head whipped around, looking for kidnapping Necron thieves. Fortunately, not a single such bastards materialized, and Weber relaxed a fraction. His shoulder twitched at the sudden movement, reminding him that his new arm still needed some time to properly heal and adjust. That was irrelevant. The flesh was weak and of little consequence when an Inquisitor gave you an order. Besides, failing a living saint, who was your friend as well, would be even worse if that was at all possible. Mother would never forgive him. Charles kept looking suspiciously around, but no one paid them much attention when the parade began. At least Selene was happy at the circus. She kept waving a small flag from her exalted position on the shoulders of the Ogrin sergeant, which gave her an even better view of the street below. It was a nice parade. Charles could allow that much. It was appropriately patriotic and held an incredible amount of hard-fought promise. It was tangible proof that with the Inquisitor leading them, they could achieve the impossible, destroy demons for good, smite overwhelming numbers of Xenos and traitors, even convince some Xenos to fight for the Imperium. Such was the power of a saint, just like in his mother's stories. It had been the utmost privilege to watch Inquisitor Vale earn such acclaim and recognition from humble beginnings. And it was his eternal honor to be by Delcatar's side. The parade continued without a hitch, and it began soothing Charles's frayed nerves. The music was properly uplifting and enjoyable. It was always a joy to see happy crowds cheering at the guard, especially when the Imperium's soldiers fought so hard to keep those people safe. Charles allowed himself a small content smile. Eventually, it was time for the Mechanicus part of the show, sanctifying the cannon in the name of the Omnissiah and returning it into the fold or something like that. At that point, everything went wrong, fast. Charles's first clue that trouble was afoot came when the Inquisitor soared upon fiery wings, a bad sign that, and landed just out of sight. A wave of something nasty exploded from the cannon and rippled through the air. It clashed with the Emperor's divine energy wielded by the Inquisitor. However, even that wasn't enough to contain it. The Commissar grimaced when he saw at least a couple of dozen tech priests liquefy, only for their remains to turn into diseased flesh that began crawling up the cannon. A really bad sign, that. "We're moving," he snapped, holding back a vile curse. The questions were, where should they go and do what exactly? All around them, people fell, suddenly laid low by something looking like a terrible disease. It wasn't hard to connect the dots at that point. The reason why Charles, the Ogrins and guardsmen around them were still hale was obvious. Celine's unpleasant aura just saved them a world of pain. "Demon incursion," Weber hissed. Just looking at the cannon and what was happening there made bile rise in his throat. "We're going in." He looked around the people fallen around and writhing in pain. "Watch where you step. Keep away from the blood," he barked in his best commissar voice. At least the others not crippled by the demonic disease wasted little time and engaged the demon. Even the Necrons, who stepped into existence from thin air, while more of them appeared on the heels of lightning strikes. Multiple tanks and lighter vehicles opened fire as well, shooting straight and true. No ordinary monster could have survived the onslaught, especially when it would have to contend with a saint as well. Unfortunately, this must be their luck. The demon didn't go down. Instead, it kept growing and even multiplying, the rotten bastard. "Push through. Sergeant, get Celine to the saint. We're going to kill that thing before it can claim the city. For the Emperor!" Weber shouted over the mixed sounds of combat, screams, prayers, and music. Why wasn't there a flamer at hand when you needed one? The warp around Kronus. Nurgle retreated in a hurry, and Revelation was glad for it. There was no question the Emperor was much more powerful than that diseased sack of offal. Unfortunately, his current state was a great drawback when such confrontations were concerned. Even now he had to strain in order to keep himself from ascending. The power he had access to when not holding back was addicting. It drowned most of the agony that was his world for what felt like an eternity now, and the last thing he wanted was to let go and go back. In hindsight, it was a good thing that Revelation was the principal shard of his being bound to the Golden Throne. Many pieces wouldn't have chosen to go back for humanity's sake. They would have told themselves that ascension was the only path left and gone for it. Ascension in his current state meant damning Segmentum Solar, tearing off the heart of the Imperium and consuming the souls of countless trillions. That was the last option. Unless Cadia fell and chaos rend the galaxy asunder, Revelation would keep fighting, keep struggling to give humanity a fighting chance. He briefly gazed at Kronus, and while the continents were all in the wrong shape, it reminded him why he fought. It helped him remember Terra as it once was, blue, green, and pristine. The pain, jubilation, and hopes of the millions in Victory Bay, their hope for a better tomorrow, and most importantly, their faith that it was all possible because of him, were a balm to the Emperor's tortured soul. With one last effort, he gathered some of the wasted power racing outwards after the clash with Nurgle. He sent it at the planet, using his agent there as a focus. Nurgle's plagues wouldn't claim this world. They wouldn't turn today's efforts into an exercise of frustration. Revelation let his power wash over Kronus and reined himself in, falling back towards the Golden Throne and the indescribable agony waiting to greet him with a vengeance. Now he had to hope that Chaos got the message. While he would meet any such high-handed efforts with his full might, their agents could continue clashing as before. Anything more would risk ascension. Part 4. Victory Bay, Kronus. There was such a thing as too much of a good thing, especially when the warp was concerned. The Emperor's power was an ocean, and I was the cup trying to contain it. I could feel my soul crack at the strain, even as I instinctively expelled as much of the golden radiance flowing into me. Pulses of light exploded out of my body. They carried over the city, doing their best to protect everyone they touched and cleanse them from the warp-infused shit the demons did its best to spread with their mere presence. There was most certainly such a thing as too much of a bad thing, too. I could see and sense it as the psychic equivalent of rotting, disease-spilling, and maggot-infested shit slammed into the Emperor's power. While my shield held, the offal splattering over it kept going and taking root in countless people. It was only their burning faith and the Emperor's light illuminating the place that still kept them alive. I had no idea how I knew that, yet I was certain of it. If I lost this clash, or if I had to simply pull back to regroup, thousands, tens of thousands would die in agony. Their deaths would empower the demon. As things stood, all I could do was hold my ground and endure while gods clashed nearby. For those of us with the eyes to see, incomprehensible amounts of power surged through the warp. Those energies slammed at each other, sending echoes through the immaterium. It was like someone released vast oceans kept at bay, and they crashed into each other with all the power and momentum bound in their surging mass. Frankly, I was surprised that any of us were still there. The aftershocks of that battle should have laid Kronus to waste and torn our souls asunder. It had to be the Emperor's light and power keeping us safe from the worst of it. Streams of bolter fire bit into corpulent, sore flesh. Lasers boiled parts of it, spreading noxious gases. Flamers arced streams of blessed promethium over our heads to create a wall of cleansing fire. Behind me, Scipio, Charon, and a few other higher-ranked Martians finally got out of their stupor and screeched in sheer electronic fury. It was impressive, really. Their binary scream cut right through the sound of the firefight. I couldn't spare the concentration to look over my shoulders, not that it would have helped. My wings were spread wide and burned with power. However, I didn't have to. The cogboys produced all kinds of exotic weaponry and opened fire. I could barely get a glimpse of those who survived the demon's arrival further away. Some were on the ground, others had fallen on their knees. However, most of them had weapons held by their mechadendrites and used them to shoot at the demon. It didn't matter. There was too much power for me to handle, and I couldn't cut myself off it if I tried. The sensation of your soul coming closer and closer to the bursting point was not something I could properly put into words or wanted to experience ever again. Yet there was nothing to do but endure molten metal flow through me and burn me from within. Soon there would be nothing left but a husk. The Necrons saved the day again. The tingling sensation of pylons activating washed over me. I could have sworn I felt it an eternity ago, and they did not affect us. However, now the power slamming into me was something I could handle, if barely. I was surprised to find myself on my feet, holding a flaming sword. This was the same sword I used the first time the Emperor granted me his blessing to burn through that damn orc. The last thing I could recall was that I was on my knees struggling not to die because too much of the Emperor's power flowed through me. Everything hurt. My soul was tender, roasted and cracked, then fused back together somehow. Moving was agony, yet surprisingly enough, I could put it at the back of my head, which was growing clearer with every passing heartbeat. I spared a moment to glance around and assess the situation. No Nurgling could reach our position. However, beyond a small area around me, soldiers barely stood on their feet, while blood caked their faces. Scores of troopers couldn't do that much and collapsed, creating a small wall of corpses between the demon and the rest of the city. There was even the odd citizen I could see drag their bleeding bodies forward. They reached the fallen troopers and picked up a weapon, only to collapse after shooting a few times downrange. At this rate, there would be more Necron troopers standing than ours, and the demon still refused to die. It kept reforming globs of diseased flesh, using Nurgle's own power to do it at a prodigious rate. Even with the Emperor himself above us pushing back the Chaos God, the unclean one in front of us was supercharged. The be-damned thing appeared as a dark star made of everything rotting, corrupted, and unspeakable you could think of, and then some, left to stew and ferment for eternity. Warp-borne diseases and parasites writhed under rotting skin, rotting pulses slammed against the Emperor's light, cursing this park for generations to come. That thing had to go, or we were all doomed. I gathered as much of the Emperor's energy as I could contain. This was the Emperor's pure cleansing light. It was an anathema to everything sworn to chaos. It was humanity's prayer of salvation, bolstered by the fervent belief of everyone in Victory Bay. My wings acted on their own, following a barely conceived thought. They flapped with surprising power, and I rose above the ground. A heartbeat later, I soared upon fiery wings, and my light burned through the miasma of corruptions surrounding the unclean one. Where it touched it, the light seared away its flesh, cleansing wounds, burning away poisons and decay, and incinerating sickness. Suddenly the damn thing was in front of me, and I did as my sword instructor kept hammering in my head during basic training, stuck it with the pointy end. Then I unleashed all the energy burning through me, using the blade to channel it into the daemon. What might have been a misshapen leg, fused to the cannon, exploded into cleansing fire. The demon recoiled and roared in pain, shaking everything around us. The fire persisted, spreading and searing away everything it touched. A wing beat later, I soared near the top of the cannon and fell upon the monstrosity infesting it, stabbing and cutting at it with wild Abaddon. I kept pulling as much of the Emperor's power as the pylons allowed me, then immediately channeled it into smiting blows. Thunder surrounded me, and the Emperor's power cut down to nearly a trickle. My wings fluttered and beat furiously to keep me floating just above the demon, who recoiled as if touching a live power line. For the first time since it appeared, the demon was trying to get away from the cannon, fused to its rotting flesh. "In the Emperor's name I smite thee," Charles' faint voice echoed from below. It was barely audible over the sheer sound of the fighting and screams. "With his fury I burn thee." The source of thunder was my Ogryns, happily blasting at the demon with their shotguns. And the reason suddenly the Emperor's light felt so distant was Celine, who held to Sergeant Bron's neck for dear life, while he kept shooting at the abomination. What the hell was she doing here? Those idiots had one Emperor-damned job. My spluttering fury was short-lived. A final divine clash rends the warp asunder. The mere echoes from it nearly overwhelmed both the pylons and Celine's aura. The Emperor's power washed over the whole planet and flowed into me. It burned hot with echoes of fury. It shone brightly with the promise of victory. And just like that, the torrent of corrupted energy feeding the demon vanished, replaced by a shower of light that burned it. The Emperor won his battle. Now it was time for us to... Gold. My world exploded with radiance. More power than I could comprehend flowed through me. My soul cracked under the strain. An infinite mind or the next best thing focused on me for a moment. Or perhaps it was an eternity. The world ended in golden fire. Chapter 17, Parts 5 and 6. Chapter 17, Kronus Endgame. Part 5, Victory Bay, Kronus. The Inquisitor exploded in stark, blinding light. One moment he flew on wings burning with the Emperor's power, hacking at the demon. In the next, everyone had to close their eyes and avert their faces. The light was savage, yet gentle. It burned away any doubt of its origin. It was pure, blessed divinity. The moment passed, and Charles blinked away stars while his mouth mechanically murmured prayers to the God Emperor. He could see a different light now. The Saint and Emperor together vanquished the demon. The ill-formed monstrosity imploded. Its cursed flesh collapsed and burned with white cleansing flames that quickly consumed it and melted the corrupted cannon. Above them, the Saint floated on fluttering wings and glowed brightly with soft golden light. Flickering moths of the Emperor's power fell from the sky like fresh snow, often bursting into flames when they touched corruption and burned it away. Ave Imperator! Weber saluted the glowing sky with his sword and looked around. No more small demons were running around. Whatever just happened burned them all to ash. Good. The soothing light washed over and sunk into stumbling soldiers and the odd civilian. Moths of light fell upon their skin, and the gold flame burned through their forms, causing no visible damage. Within moments, their hacking cough ceased, and no more fresh blood flowed down their faces. "The Emperor protects," Charles whispered in reverence. He was sure this was happening all over the city. The Emperor knew his own and wouldn't let them down. Gradually, everyone ceased firing at the burning demon and simply watched its corpulent flesh turn into ash. Only the low rumble of vehicles and quiet prayers carried over the parade grounds. A flicker of motion caught Weber's attention, and he saw the saint float down until he was beside them. The bright flames licking his wings doused themselves, leaving behind gold-flecked feathers. Only Bron's quick reaction held the Inquisitor from falling face-first on the ground when the Emperor's power ceased filling him, leaving not quite a mortal behind. "Medici," Bron bellowed. "We need Medici for the Inquisitor." Again, Charles mentally added, "Don't let him out of your sight, Sergeant," the Commissar ordered. "Karam, are you still alive? Get your metal-platted arse over here." A small group of tech priests shuffled forward. Their mechadendrites twitched in confusion. Charles didn't need to understand binary to get that they were all busy praying due to the low and reverent tone they whistled in. Surprising conclusion. The Inquisitor still has all his bits attached. One of the Necrons said aloud before flickering out of sight. "Help the Inquisitor, then get all Medici we have out and about, aiding the wounded." Charles snapped out of his daze and began barking orders to everyone in earshot. This wasn't how Amberly expected to die, choking on her blood and helplessness, while others fought whatever attacked the parade. Probably a Nurgle demon. It was either that or someone, likely the Necrons, unleashed a nanotech weaponry on them. The latter option was unlikely. The damage wouldn't be so localized, and being eaten alive from outside and inside would have hurt more. A point both for and against the Necrons was that they were fighting against something nearby. As far as Amberly could see from where she collapsed on the stands, the Blood Ravens fought alongside the aliens, so it was almost certainly a third party. However, if these were her last minutes, she would go to spend them like a proper Inquisitor, paranoid to the end. A whiff of rot and other fouler things carried over the stands from the battlefield, clinching it. The servants of Nurgle made an appearance too. It also confirmed what Amberly already not so secretly believed: Kronus was cursed. It had to be. Otherwise, these things wouldn't keep happening. At least the light show was pretty. It was properly golden and soothing. The glow coming from just out of sight sunk into Amberly, warming her up. It somewhat soothed her coughing, though didn't stop her from throwing viscera from her ravaged lungs. Vale saw Mott drag himself up, using a seat as a lever. The old man stumbled her way, swaying on his bionic legs, and soon collapsed on his knees. Blood spilled from his mouth, and he doubled over, coughing. A twitching arm pulled out an injector from his robes, and after 2 tries slammed it at the side of his neck, then went back for a second one. Amberly cursed herself for only carrying a small med pack with trauma supplies and combat stimulants. The former wouldn't help, and the latter would almost certainly kill her before she could do anything useful. In this particular case, Mott had been the wiser. He managed to get another injector out and rolled it her way before collapsing. It was another question how much whatever was inside would help. Probably wide-spectrum antibiotics. Seeing no alternative, Amberly crawled forward. Each movement tired her more and made her struggle to get enough air. If they lived, they would need a set of new lungs. That much she was sure of it. The Inquisitor managed to get the injector and use it, and by then she was sure the strain was going to kill her. Scratch that, Amberly decided. It probably already killed her. She beheld one of the Emperor's angels rise above the stand on wings of fire, burning sword in hand. While Amberly didn't pay attention, the ugly form of a Nurgle demon had manifested over the cannon only to be struck down by the furious angel. The only odd thing was there were still Necrons firing at the demon even in the afterlife by the Emperor's side. Amberly blinked away the blood seeping from her eyes. She wasn't dead yet, not quite anyway. That was Vale, and at this point there was no denying it anymore. That insane fool had the Emperor's blessing. She giggled at that. He wasn't going to get away from serving the Imperium by merely getting shot. Watching the demon burn was pretty, and Amberly was pretty sure she was out of her right mind. She wanted Caiaphas to hug and make her forget. What did Mott put into that injector, and why was Vale blazing like a star? Gold was such a pretty color. ATBS. Quarantine the survivors, sterilize the site. Herald of victory hissed through the Necron network. His frame shook furiously. He kept burning any remaining lump of rotting flesh with extreme prejudice. Amakun felt a little better. That abomination and what it implied was infuriating. It wasn't hard to reach conclusions as to its real origin and that of the entity it served. The Necrons learned much about the warp during the war in heaven. They had to win. While they couldn't manipulate it directly and thus never fully understand it, they did know things, like the most likely origin of the great abomination called Nurgle. While it might be just an extrapolation and theory right now, if one based on experience, what they learned through captured records and the odd interrogation, the conclusion was sound. Perhaps this was as sound a conclusion as they would ever get. The so-called chaos gods embodied concepts that were near universal to sentient life. They began as concepts written over into the warp at the time of the Necron and the Old Enemy. War, bloodshed, and carnage on an unprecedented scale unleashed during the war in heaven. Khorne. All the changes and plans devised in the lead-up, during, and in the immediate aftermath of the conflict. Tzeentch. The Eldari could keep their claim to fame in creating that particularly vile abomination, Slaanesh. Thank you very much. They earned it. Death, rot, and decay, the nihilism of the Necrontyr who lived their short lives in pain and despair, it was those things that formed Nurgle. That particular abomination was the cursed fate of what the Necrons used to be, made manifest. The Necrons loathed the very idea with a passion they believed lost during the biotransference. The Necrons would deny those abominations everything they could. They would spite them at every turn. It might take another 60 million years, however, Amakun wouldn't rest until he saw them broken, shattered, and bound, just like the C'tan, especially the one styling itself Nurgle. Part 6. Ores Tashan, Kronus. For more than 2 days, fire warriors, Vespid scouts and Kroot auxiliaries ran all over the capital, hunting down orcs. The foolish brute's cruiser fell in pieces showering Tau-controlled territory. That setback not only caused a meaningful amount of damage, but masked the landing of the Green Menace. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of those things fell all over the near-pristine capital, sending it in a time of chaos and bloodshed. Commander Kais, this is unacceptable. Aunel Shi'ors admonished. There is no organized resistance. This isn't a green tide stretching from horizon to horizon. They have no vehicles and little heavy weaponry to speak of. We have only 2 Vespid scout squads left and a small number of Kroot auxiliaries. Our infantry isn't suited for city fighting, Shaso Kais patiently explained. He burned to get into his battle suit and join the hunt for the orcs. Instead, thanks to his injuries and the fact that his trusty suit was little more than scrap now, he wasn't fit for combat duty. Kais had to command from a headquarters far away from the fighting. That much would have been tolerable if the venerable ethereal hasn't been harder to endure with every passing hour. We lack the usual heavy vehicle support. The commander kept explaining. Eventually the ethereal might get a clue and shut up, or even offer some constructive criticism. Usually, Shi'ors was much better than this. The ethereal was a great administrator and orator. With a few kind words, Shi'ors was able to restore faltering morale. Just as easily, he could heal cracks in the belief in the greater good. However, the civilian leader wasn't a warrior, and it showed when things went wrong. Kais looked away from the holographic tactical table showing the worst-hit parts of the city. And the ethereal. Even in the secure command center, he could sniff whiffs of ash and scorched flesh. Parts of the capital still burned, thanks to orcs running around attacking anyone in sight. Dislodging them proved especially hard without enough auxiliary support and the need to keep collateral damage contained. Otherwise, Kais might have called orbital support already and purged those ugly brutes from the face of the world. We're making slow but steady progress, Ethereal. Kais looked back at Shi'ors after taking a moment to calm himself as it was proper. Everything for the greater good. We've been isolating the infested areas and setting up containment zones using clear firing lanes. That way we're playing to our advantage. Entering close combat with orcs is a losing proposition. Ideally, you either burned them out from orbit or fell back while shooting them to pieces. This insane orbital drop forced the Tau warriors to fight contrary to their well-tested doctrine. Predictably, the outcome wasn't pretty. Now, more than ever, Kais regretted the loss of the Kroot auxiliaries in the human Necron trap. His heavy mobile forces would have been of little use within the heavy build-up capital anyway, but the Kroot close-quarter fighters, even the few he had left, were proving invaluable. Kais opened his mouth to explain the situation to the agitated Ethereal again, and paused. She-Oz knew all of this. The commander studied the Ethereal more carefully, and the signs were there. She-Oz was deeply troubled and was quite bad at hiding it right now. He hadn't been acting this way when they got news of the cruiser heading their way, or when it began raining orcs. "It's not the Greenskins' incursion troubling you, is it, Honored One?" Kais asked quietly. "You were too busy commanding to watch the humans' victory parade," She-Oz eventually said. "I want to dismiss what I saw as mere propaganda aimed to demoralize us. Or for internal consumption, most humans are religious fanatics." The Ethereal scoffed at that. Kais nodded along. That much was well known. One of those things manifested in Victory Bay, spreading sickness and disease over the human military and citizens alike. That wasn't exactly a piece of good news, even if it meant the odds of conventional assault from that corner lowered drastically. Or they would if what the Ethereal saw was true. However, mentioning one of those things outside of a private and very secure setting was never a good sign. "Will we have to face it?" Kais whispered. Without his mobile forces, he would need to call the fleet for fire support. As much as they could provide at that. "It was banished within minutes," She-Oz answered. So it was either one of the weaker ones, or not, which was worse, both because it would manifest here and because the humans and their allies could handle it in short order. Neither of those things pointed at a good outcome when the enemy came for them. We received a new ultimatum as well. We're to surrender unconditionally, or get on our ships and leave while abandoning our military gear and industry. She-Oz grimaced, without sabotaging them. Otherwise they would purge us with orbital fire and make use of what scraps they can recover from the ashes. Our remaining ships are a rough match for the humans in the system. If their allies are as powerful in space as on the ground, the Ethereal didn't have to finish that thought. "What is your recommendation, Commander Kais?" "Our military position is untenable. We won't be able to hold for long without massive reinforcements, both in naval elements and heavy ground combat forces. My recommendation is to do whatever you believe will serve the greater good best." "I've been struggling with that question for days now. We can't evacuate everyone even if we leave our war gear behind. Our ships lack the space and life support to do it." Both understood that the Ethereal meant they could lift their military with ample space to spare, and the local auxiliary forces as well. However, by leaving, they would have to leave behind most citizens sworn to follow the greater good, both Tau and alien alike. "You lead and we will follow," Kais vowed. "Victory Bay, Kronus." "You're awake." Antaeus stood by my bed again. This time he was in his power armor, complete with helmet and weapons. I blinked at him with bleary eyes. Everything hurt, including parts I didn't know were there or could ache. Like the tips of my feathers. As if that wasn't enough, my mind churned with barely remembered dreams. They were flashes from countless lives across the millennia. While they were fading quickly, I could piece together a few odd pieces. I could see humans and aliens living together, fighting and dying together when a machine tide rose to tear them all asunder. I could see Xenos turning upon humanity in our darkest hour. Yet a few others stood their ground and fought beside us to the bitter end. None of those blessed loyalists made it past the Great Crusade. Those who were still alive were shattered remnants corrupted by lies spread by chaos. The others? They either fell during the Iron War or fell victim to the insanity that swallowed the galaxy, heralding Slaanesh's imminent birth. What was the message? That we can't trust any Xeno that was still alive in this cursed age? That they would eventually betray us when it suited them? Or perhaps that while all of the above was true, there were a few trustworthy species left even if they were inconsequential in the great scheme of things? I'm glad to report that this time you managed to remain intact. No missing pieces we could find. Antaeus rumbled in good cheer. In related news, after yesterday, there is no hope denying it. You're a living saint blessed by the Emperor, lad. Well done. The librarian saluted me. I was sure he had a fake tear in a corner of his eye, too. After all, his voice was an interesting mix of approval and sarcasm. I've dreamed of strange portents, Antaeus, of ages long past, and of truths that are considered heresy these days. And I have an insane plan that I need your help with. I smiled, and it bloody hurt. I'm afraid to ask, Inquisitor. I will anyway. What insanity will you drag us into this time? Right now, we'll be merely paving the way. In the fullness of time, we're going to liberate the Tau from the control of the ethereals and bring them in the fold as sanctioned Xenos and competent auxiliary troops for use by the Inquisition, Ordo Xenos in particular. Preferably, we'll do it before our new allies decide the Tau might be more useful than we are. I'm mistaken, Inquisitor. You've lost your mind and what little sense you had left, Antaeus mournfully declared. You want to be labeled as heretic and shot, don't you? The Tau are pawns the ethereals use to gain power, status, and prestige, and they're using them against us, along with their various auxiliary alien forces. I know for a fact that several Inquisitors and rogue traders are using Kroot and Vespid mercenaries, sometimes even the odd Orc band. When we're done with them, the Tau will be our pawns to use against the enemies of the Imperium. I explained the end goal. Now the only little problem was to figure out how to get there. Inquisitor, are you trying to start a crusade again? Antaeus bemoaned. A crusade? If properly handled, there's some merit to the idea. I paused when my mind registered what he said in full. What do you mean again?